The first time I saw a number floating above someone's head, I thought I was having a nervous breakdown in very expensive air conditioning. It was a Thursday afternoon in Gangnam, raining hard enough to make the glass outside the conference room look blurred and unstable. I was standing behind three directors from Heesung Advisory while they explained to a retail conglomerate chairman why his offshore holding structure was not technically illegal yet. And above the chairman's silver hair, glowing in an impossible red, I saw Won 4 981 220 000. Unpaid tax recoverable. I blinked, the number stayed. The chairman kept talking. My managing director kept smiling. Somebody across the polished table used the phrase strategic timing. The number over the chairman's head kept burning like a second subtitle that only I could read. That was the moment my old life ended. Not because of the number itself, because of what happened after I tested it. I spent the next hour staring at everyone I could without looking insane. One junior associate, nothing. One receptionist, nothing. My team leader, 1,218,000,000. The vice president from the client side, 1,730,000,000. Another chairman walking through the corridor, 1,8,402,000,000, and a watch worth more than my father's shop. By the time I got home that night, I understood the rule. The number only appeared above people hiding taxes illegally. Not aggressive deductions. Not accounting mistakes. Not gray zone interpretation. Illegal, hidden, recoverable. I was 28 years old, already tired in the permanent way men become tired when they work too close to rich people's lies, and the universe had apparently decided to hand me one supernatural talent, specifically designed to get me killed by men who could afford discreet violence. My name was Shin Jaehyeon, and back then I worked in private tax consulting. That sounds cleaner than it was. What I actually did was help wealthy clients move liabilities into safer weather, build distance between assets and names, and make the worst men in Seoul feel intelligent for stealing elegantly. We never called it theft. We called it planning, structuring, optimization, risk sequencing, timing discipline. Every form of high-end corruption eventually develops its own luxury vocabulary. That was my business, or at least it had been. I grew up poor enough to know exactly what taxes looked like from the other side. My father ran a tiny hardware and supply shop that survived mostly because my mother knew how to stretch rice, patience, and dignity farther than any human being should have to. We paid everything. We paid late sometimes, painfully often, but we paid. We paid because people like us do not get strategic interpretation. We get deadlines, notices, and men at district offices whose tone tells us the law is real only in our direction. That's why I went into tax work in the first place. Not because I believed in justice, because I believed in proximity. I thought if I got close enough to money, I would stop being someone it happened to and start being someone it listened to. I was smart enough to rise, not strong enough to stay clean. By 28, I could walk into a room, read a holding structure, and tell within 10 minutes where the body was buried and how much it had cost to decorate the soil. I was good. My bosses knew it. Our clients knew it. That is why I got invited into the ugly rooms and never quite allowed to own the final credit. Then the numbers appeared, and suddenly every rich liar in Seoul started walking around with a confession above his head. The first person I tested seriously was Director Wu, my immediate superior. He was a smooth man in his 40s with a church deacon's smile and a criminal's respect for tailoring. He had taught me more practical tax law in 2 years than university had in 4, and he had also taught me the first adult rule of private advisory life. If a structure makes you uncomfortable, ask yourself whether the discomfort comes from legal risk or class envy. If it's class envy, shut up and bill more hours. When I walked into his office the next morning, the red amount above his head read 1,612, 400, 000. He looked up from a file and said, "If you're carrying that expression because of yesterday's chairman, lose it. Clients love confidence. Even stupid confidence does half the work." I closed the door behind me. "The overseas royalty chain doesn't match the domestic declarations," I said. He smiled. "That is not your concern. It becomes my concern when the same mismatch appears across 3 related entities, and all 3 happen to be paying your favorite legal boutique." That made him go still. Good. Men like him always tell on themselves by how quickly they stop pretending you're young. Sit down, he said. I stayed standing. He looked at me for a second too long and then asked, very softly, what exactly are you implying? I should have backed down there. If I had still been sane, I would have. Instead, I said, I'm implying you've started treating hidden tax exposure as a service premium. His face hardened by 1 degree. That was enough to make the room colder. Then he leaned back, folded his hands, and gave me the most professional threat I'd heard in my life up to that point. Jaehyeon, he said, people in your position make one of two mistakes. They either think seeing the dirt makes them brave, or they think understanding the dirt makes them indispensable. Usually they discover they are neither. The number above his head burned brighter. 1612, 400, 000. I left his office shaking in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with scale. Because by then, I had already checked enough people in the firm to understand the pattern was not local rot. It was the structure. Directors, client heirs, finance officers, legal intermediaries, charity foundation chairs, political aides in expensive suits, even one tax official who came through the office as a private policy consultant, every quarter and left with envelopes no one put in the accounting system. If the numbers were real, then Seoul's upper floors were glowing red and pretending not to notice. That should have made me more careful. It made me angrier. So I copied files. Not many, enough. Cross-border licensing. Gift tax suppression through family foundations. Property transfers disguised as debt recovery. Luxury art purchases routed through donor vehicles. All the usual Korean rich people creativity, but cleaner and better dressed. Then I made the stupidest and most important decision of my life. I reported them. Not publicly. Not dramatically. I packed the files, printed the chains, wrote an unsigned summary, and dropped the whole thing into a National Tax Service whistleblower intake box 3 subway lines away from my office. Then I went back to work like a man who had not just tried to set fire to the walls from the inside. 10 days later, inspectors walked into Heesung Advisory. No one yelled. Serious money never yells first. It sits straighter, calls legal, and starts calculating which younger employee can be turned into the point of failure before dinner. Director Wu looked at the inspectors. Then at the conference room. Then at me. That was all. No accusation. No scene. I knew I was done. They didn't fire me on the spot. That would have been crude. Heesung was far too civilized for that. They waited 2 weeks, tightened 3 internal narratives, hinted to exactly the right people in the advisory market that I had mishandled confidential client material under emotional strain, and then let me go for procedural breaches inconsistent with fiduciary responsibility. I was too toxic for the good firms. Too loud in the wrong way for the bad ones. Too proud to go crawling back to the men, whose numbers still floated red in my memory. I spent 8 months unemployed and angry. 8 months watching red numbers above men in imported cars, above restaurant owners laundering through cousins, above assemblymen at funerals, above pastors in private clubs, above investment bankers, heirs, local fixers, and one TV celebrity whose smile turned out to be worth 380,000,000 in undeclared endorsement routing. 8 months realizing that seeing corruption is useless if all it gives you is private misery. That was when I applied to the National Tax Service. My father laughed so hard he had to take off his glasses. You got ruined by rich tax thieves, he said. Now you want to become a tax officer. I want access. You want revenge. That too. My mother from the kitchen said, good. Revenge is a terrible life plan and an excellent entrance exam fuel. She was right. I studied like a man, trying to punch his way into the state. And somehow, against every story the country tells itself about merit and every private network it actually runs on, I passed. The first day I put on a National Tax Service badge, I looked in the mirror and saw the exact kind of bureaucrat my father used to fear when brown envelopes arrived at the shop. Then I smiled. Because this time, for once, the people with the red numbers were the ones who should have been afraid. The National Tax Service did not feel like justice. It felt like an older, more disciplined version of every Korean institution I had already learned to distrust. Bad coffee, fluorescent lights, overworked analysts, territorial managers, men whose whole personalities had been filed into regulations and then stamped approved. There were patriots, yes. There were cowards too, careerists, procedural fetishists, quietly decent people, quietly rotten ones. If private consulting had taught me how the rich stole, the service taught me how the state learned to blink in socially acceptable places. My first unit chief was Section Chief Nam Do-hoon, a man with a thin face, a permanently skeptical mouth, and the kind of stare public servants develop when they've spent 15 years watching politicians call theft economic flexibility. He read my file, looked at the line where my former private sector experience sat like a warning label and said, "Everyone who comes from private advisory thinks two things. First, that we move too slowly. Second, that the reason we move slowly is stupidity. They are usually wrong about the cause and right about the speed." I liked him immediately. Not warmly. Professionally. He spoke like someone who had stopped mistaking cynicism for intelligence a long time ago. The office around him was a museum of Korean tax reality, small business discrepancies, family transfer underreporting, restaurant cash suppression, fake invoices, quiet inheritance evasion by people with good church reputations and bad nephews, important work, necessary work, and nowhere near the size of the red numbers I could see floating above half the men in Gangnam. That was the first lesson Nam beat into me. "You want to catch the big fish," he said during my third week, after I had visibly lost patience with a mid-level cosmetics distributor trying to erase VAT through ghost vendors. "Then stop looking at small fraud like it's beneath you. Small fraud teaches method. Big fraud just adds better cufflinks." He was right. Unfortunately, he usually was. So I learned the office properly. How to read filings without performing superiority about it. How to build an audit chain that would survive a lawyer, a director, and one phone call from a man who had once shaken the right assemblyman's hand. How to distinguish incompetence, desperation, habit, and deliberate concealment. Most importantly, how not to let the red number above someone's head make me lazy. That was harder than people think. A supernatural hint is not evidence. It is direction. The number told me where hidden tax existed. It did not tell me how it had been hidden, who had protected it, or what paper trail could be made to survive daylight. If I ever let the number substitute for actual work, I stopped being an investigator and became a lunatic with beautiful instincts. So I dug. My first clean case came through a mid-level real estate broker named Han Seokman. The number above his head was only 1,410,000,000, nothing special by Seoul standards, but his returns were too neat, and his declared gift sequences too stupidly convenient. Everyone else in the unit treated him like a routine corrective audit. I built the family map, traced the gift timing, lined it against property title movement, and found the cousin. There is always a cousin. If not a cousin, an aunt. If not an aunt, a friend from military service who suddenly develops asset management talent worth 9 figures. When I laid it out for Nam, he stared at the file, turned one page, then another, and said, "You write like a man who has worked around liars." "I have." "Good, don't let it become your whole personality." He approved the audit. Han Seokman folded in 3 days. Not because I was intimidating. Because once you break the first explanatory lie cleanly, men like him feel the floor move under every other sentence they plan to say. He tried the usual things: confusion, deference, family misunderstanding, accountant blame. But the timing grid was too tight, and the cousin too poor at acting surprised. That case got me noticed in the office. Not admired. Not yet. Noticed. The younger analysts started treating me like the private sector transplant who might actually be useful instead of ornamental. One senior deputy began testing whether I was reckless or simply hungry. Nam became ruder in the way older men sometimes become ruder once they've decided a junior might be worth the effort. That counted as trust. The larger case found me in month 4. A shipping magnate's son, foundation board member, public donor, easy television smile, 1-800-000-000 floating above his head like an accusation the country had gotten too rich to read properly. The formal file that landed on our desk looked harmless enough. One land transfer discrepancy. One gift tax adjustment question. One local office note about valuation timing. Routine, if you were blind in the way institutions prefer. I was. The son had 6 related entities. 3 of them touched cultural development. One of them donated boats to youth programs. Another bought land from a family side company and sold it 18 months later under a completely different valuation logic that only made sense if you already knew the tax had been meant to disappear between signatures. I took the outline to Nam. He read it, looked at me, looked at the family name, looked back at me. You enjoy ending your own probation, don't you? I enjoy when the numbers stop insulting me. That got me the faintest exhale that might have counted as amusement in a kinder man. The problem wasn't proving tax exposure. The problem was political geometry. The family had a charity wing, a university endowment line, a cousin married into media. And most annoyingly, the son himself had perfected the modern elite Korean face. Not arrogant enough to offend on camera, not humble enough to look fake, just the right amount of public service performance around a private appetite large enough to float 8.4 billion won in glowing red over his hair. The file moved slowly, then carefully, then sideways. One director asked for scope discipline. Another hinted the foundation side made optics delicate. Someone from a different bureau suddenly wanted to coordinate interpretation, which in state language usually means the target's people have already started making the right calls, and now the institution is deciding whether the law is still in the mood to be itself today. Nam made me rewrite the memo twice. Not because my logic was wrong. Because every sentence in a politically sensitive tax file has to do 3 things at once: tell the truth, survive interference, and deny cowards any plausible route to claim they merely misunderstood what the evidence showed. By the time the preliminary audit launched, I had learned something useful and ugly. Private firms train young men to fear rich clients. The state trains them to fear rich clients more politely. That was the day I decided I would stay. Not forever, maybe. Not naively. But long enough to force a few numbers all the way through the machine. Because for the first time in my life, the rich men with red numbers over their heads were going to have to look at a desk I sat behind and wonder whether the bill was finally catching up. People imagine tax investigation as spreadsheets and subpoenas. That's cute. Real tax investigation is anthropology with penalties. Family structures. Divorces that happen on paper but not in money. Church donations that behave like laundering. Golf club friendships that become invoice routes. Fathers who gift daughters apartments through companies supposedly formed to support art education. Mistresses hidden as consultants. Drivers whose names appear on holding entities because rich men eventually run out of relatives willing to look innocent in a courtroom. The first time I said any version of that out loud in the office, the youngest analyst on our team laughed into her coffee and section chief Nam said, "Good, you've stopped sounding like a textbook." That analyst was Lee Sira. 26, first posting in Seoul, sharp enough to frighten men who still believed youth should arrive apologetically. She was also one of the first people in the office to realize I was using the work differently, not cutting corners, not hunting theatrics, just asking follow-up questions as if I already knew the first lie wasn't where the file ended. That made us useful together quickly. Sira was excellent with pattern retention, especially across families. She could look at 3 transfer chains, 2 inheritance declarations, 1 marriage timeline, and tell you where the emotional stupidity in the rich person's plan had likely left a tax scar. That matters more than people think. Wealthy people are not undone only by greed. They are undone by greed plus vanity plus the belief that their private life should remain tax-exempt if dressed in enough social prestige. Our first true joint war came through a church elder. That sounds small until you live in Korea long enough to understand how often money launders itself through sincerity before re-entering the bloodstream wearing moral perfume. Elder Kim was beloved in his district. Scholarships, soup kitchens, polite interviews. His number, however, floated above him at 1-2-130-000-000, which is far more than Christian humility generally requires. The formal trigger on the file was inheritance adjustment. The real trigger was his son. There is always a son. The son had a construction company too small to explain the apartment line and too well positioned to be accidental. The elder had made donations to a welfare trust that then somehow acquired land from a cousin who later sold development rights back to the son's company through a church-adjacent vehicle. It was one of those cases where the paperwork looks almost laughably obvious once you stop respecting the target's reputation enough to let it do any of the legal work. Sira found the cousin. I found the sequencing gap. Together we built the chain. When we took it to Nam, he read half of it and said, "Do either of you attend church?" "No," I said. Sira said, "Only funerals." "Good, then no one can accuse you of denominational bias when this turns ugly." It did turn ugly. Not because the law was unclear. Because respectability hates being audited in public. Elder Kim came into the first meeting with exactly the face old men wear when they think civility itself should count as evidence. He called us young. He called himself foolish with paperwork. He talked about ministry, sacrifice, and service to the district. The number above his head stayed bright and steady the whole time. I let him talk. Then I asked why a charitable land acquisition had later generated private development gained through his son's company, while remaining invisible to the declared gift pattern. He stopped smiling. That is the useful moment in every rich person audit, not when they get angry, when they stop believing charm will finish the file for them. The elder switched to wounded dignity. The son switched to legalistic irritation. We switched to documents. By the end of 3 weeks, the church was claiming misunderstanding. The son was pretending victimization, and the district had started whispering exactly what district whispers always sound like in Korea. Maybe they went too far, but does it really help the country to embarrass a man who has done so much good? Yes. That is usually exactly how it helps. The adjustment stuck. The elder paid. The son stopped smiling for cameras for a while. And the office learned that Sira and I were not only capable of running complex cases, but were willing to let socially protected men become publicly ordinary under the law if the paper demanded it. That got us better work. It also got us enemies. A deputy director named Oh Min-seok started noticing me around then. Not Vice President Oh from my old private life. Different species. Same hunger. Min-seok was the kind of career official who never says anything directly ambitious and somehow still always stands closest to the photo when the minister visits. He dressed like a man who believed modest ties proved moral seriousness. He used phrases like institutional trust and discipline coordination. Above his head floated 197,000,000. Petty, almost disappointing, which somehow made him more disgusting, not less. Men with small illegal numbers inside the tax service are worse than the huge thieves outside because it means they were willing to sell integrity cheaply. He cornered me after the Elder Kim case and said, "You're building a reputation." That sounds like a threat disguised as guidance. In this building, there's no reason to waste time disguising either. Fair? He asked whether I enjoyed public-facing cases. I said I enjoyed finished cases. He smiled like he had heard a cute animal make a recognizable sound. "You should be careful," he said. "There are 2 kinds of tax officers who burn out early, the ones who think the law is pure and the ones who think they are." I looked at the red amount over his head and thought about how incredibly Korean it is that even corruption inside anti-corruption institutions remains modest enough to sound offended if accused too loudly. Then I said, "Which kind are you worried I'll become?" He looked at me for a second too long. "Good." Always make the wrong man decide whether you're stupid or dangerous. The expensive kind, he said at last and walked off. That was my introduction to the real service war. Not taxpayer versus investigator. Investigator versus institution, deciding how much truth it actually wants, while still calling itself the truth. The first time I almost used the gift lazily, it was on a politician. That mattered because power tempts faster when it confirms your anger. The man was Assemblyman Park Januk. Committee face. Business development patriot. The sort of TV-friendly nationalist who says small businesses are the soul of the nation while quietly treating actual tax law like a rural custom meant for other people. He came into our orbit through a brother-in-law, a restaurant group, sudden land purchases, delayed capital gain declarations, all the ordinary prelude to something dirtier. The number over Park's head was 1,5,360,000,000. That amount hit me like adrenaline. Not because of the money. Because I wanted him. I wanted the stage. The fall. The correction. The beautiful public violence of a powerful man being dragged by tax law through the very country he kept performing concern for on television. That is when the gift becomes dangerous. Not because it lies. Because it flatters. The number above his head made me feel right before I had done the work. If I had followed that feeling instead of the process, I would have become the exact kind of fanatic section chief Nam distrusted from day one. So I did the hardest thing available. I slowed down. Built the brother-in-law map first. Then restaurant group cash variance. Then land transfer timing. Then the weirdly cheap villa purchase through the wife's art company, which made no sense until Sira found a dormant consulting entity, and I found the same law firm that had once drafted one of Heesung Advisory's favorite political liability curtains. There it was. Not magic. Method. By the time the file was strong enough to move, I hated Park more cleanly than before because now I understood the full design. The money hadn't been hidden for survival. It had been hidden because he assumed the state would never fully search itself in the neighborhoods where his kind of man lived. We took the case upward. That is where the service started behaving exactly like every Korean institution I had ever known. Careful questions. Scope caution. Interbureau coordination. Need for timing awareness. One senior official actually said, political sensitivity requires clean sequencing, which is one of those phrases that makes you want to throw a chair because what it means is this is true, but not all truths are equally welcome before certain dinners happen. Nam read the room correctly before I fully did. He pulled me aside after the second review and said, "You're angry. Good. Use that after the file is safe, not before. Right now the question is not whether he's dirty. The question is whether the dirt can be made institutional before someone personal tries to smother it." That is one of the best lessons I have ever received. Not only in tax work. In life. Personal truth is weak. Institutional truth is ugly, slow, compromised, and far more durable. We got the audit through. Not because our seniors suddenly turned brave. Because Nam forced the file into a form too stable to bury without leaving footprints on too many shoes. He was very good at that. He never performed heroism. He just built bureaucratic inevitability until cowardice became administratively expensive. The investigation lasted months. Politics dragged. Media sniffed. One columnist called it a partisan fishing expedition before the case was even halfway visible. Park kept smiling for cameras with $5.3 billion burning over his head while he talked about national discipline and family values and regulatory balance. Then the first attachment hit. One property chain. One hidden beneficial route. One relative whose declared income looked like a joke written by a nervous god. Then more. Park did not go down all at once. Men like him never do. They peel. First, the brother-in-law became the story. Then a misunderstood investment. Then a delayed declaration. Then finally, the plain shape of it all. He had used family, shell entities, and public trust as padding around money. He assumed the state would not have the appetite to count fully if he kept smiling at the right cameras. Watching that case move taught me a truth the private sector never wanted me to learn. The law does not need purity to be powerful. It needs momentum. That was good news, because pure institutions do not exist. Momentum, however, can be built. The bad news was that the more public the Park case became, the more the service itself started treating me like a variable instead of a man. A magazine called me one of the rising young tax officers behind the most aggressive anti-evasion investigations in Seoul. Someone in the office clipped it and left it on my desk. Sierra laughed. Nam looked like he wanted to burn the magazine and bury the ashes under tax code supplements. "Recognition is poison before grade 7, he said. "I'm not enjoying it." "Good, then you're not dead yet." The attention still changed things. Younger officers started asking for my view before taking politically sensitive small cases upward. One district team wanted my input on entertainment agency suppression patterns. A regional inheritance unit called because a chaebol widow's declared grief was behaving suspiciously like asset fragmentation. That should have felt satisfying. Sometimes it did. Mostly it felt like standing closer to a machine, while realizing more parts of it had decided your body was worth incorporating. That is how institutions trap the ambitious, not with praise itself, with usefulness that arrives disguised as praise. I was getting better at saying yes selectively. Also at saying no. That turned out to matter more than any arrest photo ever could. My father started taking my badge too seriously. That was both funny and dangerous. He would say things like, "Our Jaehyeon works for the National Tax Service now," in the exact tone small businessmen use when trying to make the government sound just a little more domestic than frightening. He also started calling me whenever one of his neighborhood acquaintances got a notice, as if I could explain every district office in Seoul just because I now wore the same national seal. At first I brushed it off. Then I realized the real issue was not pride. It was fear. My father still saw the tax office the way lower-middle people always see it, not as a public institution, but as a weather system that becomes real only when it turns toward them. He could understand my power upward in theory. He still did not trust power downward in practice. So one Sunday I closed the shop early with him and made him sit with me over takeout noodles while I walked him through notices, penalties, deadlines, appeal windows, and the exact difference between a legitimate assessment and an officer trying to hurry a frightened citizen past his rights. He listened with the expression of a man discovering far too late that the state had always had instructions written in readable language, just not for people too tired to believe reading would help. At the end he said, "You know what angers me? Choose one." I spent 30 years thinking the only way to survive tax people was to stay small enough they wouldn't notice me. Meanwhile, the real thieves were golfing. That stayed with me longer than the policy memos did. Because he was right. And because it explained, in one exhausted shop owner sentence, why I could not let myself become merely another ambitious investigator enjoying the hunt. This country had spent too long teaching ordinary people that tax meant fear and rich people that tax meant negotiation. I wanted to reverse that order at least a little before it swallowed me too. That became more personal the week my mother almost got pulled into somebody else's fraud. Her church friend's son, a real estate idiot with a grin I disliked on sight, had been helping older women in the district invest through a neighborhood property cooperative. When my mother casually mentioned that he'd offered her a slot because everyone says he knows how to make tax concerns disappear early, I nearly put a chopstick through the table. I made her give me the papers. The number over the son's head when I met him 2 days later outside a cafe was 1760 000 000, which for a supposedly rising neighborhood property planner is the kind of amount that tells you the smile is not ambition, it's camouflage. I did not handle the matter through personal threat. Again, you slow down or the gift turns you into a fool. I traced the cooperative, found the undeclared presale transfers. Found the fake advisory fee routing. Found 3 older investors whose money had been used as a float, while the son delayed declarations, and inflated value claims through a cousin with a surveying stamp and no shame. Then I handed the file into another district office entirely, because I wanted no trace of private retaliation, and because if I had moved on it personally, every future accusation of emotional conflict would have become available to the wrong people. The son folded fast. Men like him always do when they realize the older women they thought of as slow money suddenly connect to one younger man who reads paperwork like a threat. My mother only said one thing after I explained it all. So this is what you do all day. Not as praise, as sorrow. That was useful. Too many professions become monstrous because the people inside them only explain the work upward. They speak of impact, policy, system integrity, public trust. They stop describing the actual thing, that the work is, quite often, just preventing one slick son from turning someone else's old age into procedural confusion. When she framed it that way, it helped. Not morally, directionally. The farther I went in the service, the more I needed ordinary language waiting outside the building to tell me what the job still meant when the institution got too good at admiring itself. That mattered because the institution was starting to admire me. I got tapped for a task force in my second year. Special Asset Concealment Coordination. A terrible title. Important work. Entertainment contracts. Real estate layering. Cross-border family office movement. Crypto shadows just beginning to smell like the next decade's headache. Rich man creativity in every flavor, the tax code had not yet fully learned to curse properly. The task force was where men went if the service thought they were either promising or expendable in a useful way, often both. Section Chief Nam read the transfer note, sighed once and said, "Congratulations, you're now visible enough to be borrowed and not yet important enough to choose who buy." That sounds less congratulatory than the envelope suggested. It's more accurate. He was right, obviously. The task force sat 2 floors higher and 1 moral layer more complicated. Bigger cases, smarter evasion, more political pressure, less innocence available anywhere in the room. Perfect. Also dangerous. Because bigger corruption is seductive. The amounts flatter your anger. The targets make better stories. The media cares. Your career starts breathing harder. Men who once ignored you suddenly want briefings. Women in public policy circles call your work meaningful with the kind of eyes that suggest they know how much ambition hides inside that word. The first life would have loved all of it. The second watched carefully. Because the thing about hunting big thieves is that eventually you risk needing them. Not for money. For identity. I was not going to let that happen. I hope. The task force chief was Director Beek Hajan, which is an unfortunate amount of name for a man whose face looked like he had been carved specifically to reject enthusiasm. Beek had spent 20 years in high-end tax enforcement and carried himself like a person who had long ago accepted that rich Koreans invent 3 new ways to lie every time the National Assembly passes one law to stop the old 2. He read my file in silence, looked at the private sector history, the Park Januk case, the church elder case, the shipping family chain, and said, "People keep describing you as principled." That sounds dangerous. It sounds noisy, he corrected. We'll see whether you're useful. That was our introduction. The task force itself ran on 2 things, caffeine and quiet obsession. We were 6 officers, 2 analysts, 1 embedded financial forensic specialist, and a legal liaison who sounded bored even when explaining ruin. Everyone there had earned the seat differently. 1 woman had come up through inheritance audit and could smell hidden beneficial ownership from 3 family names away. 1 former customs liaison read shipping patterns like some people read faces. A quiet man from Busan could dismantle real estate concealment chains so quickly it felt indecent. I brought private sector pattern memory and the numbers. I did not tell anyone about the numbers. Not because I feared ridicule. Because power like that becomes unusable the second another human being knows you have it and starts building around it, whether through worship, exploitation, or fear. I had already worked too close to institutions to trust any of those outcomes. Our first major task force file was a celebrity one. I hated that. Not because celebrities deserve special protection. Because celebrity cases make institutions stupid. Half the room becomes morally excited. The other half becomes strategically timid. Everybody starts imagining headlines before evidence has finished arriving. That is how bad cases are born. The target was actor-turned-businessman Min Seong-woo, beloved enough that two assistant directors pretended not to recognize the name when the file first came through. The number over his head when he entered the district liaison room for a clarification interview. Later was Won 3, 940, 000, 000. Not life-ending. Very public if handled correctly. Min had built the usual modern stack. Entertainment income rooted through a management vehicle. Property held through a family office. Luxury purchases leased through business service entities. One charitable cultural foundation, because this country apparently cannot let wealthy men dodge taxes unless someone nearby also says the word youth. Beek did not care that the target was famous. Good. He hated fame on principle, because it made young officers mistake public satisfaction for investigative quality. He put me on sequencing, meaning I had to build the cleanest path through the file without giving defense counsel room to call the case a celebrity hunt. That part I understood too well from the private side. We started with the properties, then the endorsement routing, then the foundation, then the internal consultancy payments that were too round to be real and too small individually to spook anyone who had not spent years around polished fraud. The numbers helped, of course they did. Not by solving the case. By telling me where not to get distracted. A huge amount over a man's head is still only useful if you can separate signal from rich people clutter. The wealthy generate endless transaction fog. Gifts, trusts, consulting agreements, overseas educational fees, cousin loans, art movement, golf memberships, fake sponsorships, temporary holdings, family office nonsense. If you chase everything, you lose shape. The number let me say no early to certain tempting details and keep pushing on the routes that actually carried the hidden tax. Min's lawyers were excellent. That helped me. The better the lawyer, the cleaner the lies. Clean lies make beautiful maps. At one point during week 7, after we had already broken 2 shell explanations and 1 loyalty story from his foundation director, the legal liaison on our team looked at me and said, "You keep choosing the exact next door." Maybe I'm lucky. There's no such thing as luck after the 3rd door. Fair enough. The case broke publicly only after the file was already strong. Again sequence. The media exploded. Min's agency cried selective persecution. Fans got angry in predictable, useless directions. The ministry wanted calm. The task force wanted paper. By then, my role had quietly become central enough that people from divisions 2 floors away were starting to ask for my read on related concealment structures. That should have felt flattering. It felt dangerous. Influence in the service works the same way it works in consulting. First they ask for insight, then they ask for speed. Then they ask for silence in one place and clarity in another. And if you enjoy any of that too much, you wake up one day confusing personal value with institutional indispensability. So I built a rule. No case where I could not explain the human point in plain language after midnight was a case I trusted my own ambition inside. That sounds dramatic. It was. It was practical. If a file became only about scale, publicity, money, politics, or how satisfying the fall might look, then I was already halfway toward becoming the kind of hunter who needs prey more than justice. I had seen too many investigators in both public and private spheres eventually turn moral appetite into identity because the alternative, ordinary life, ordinary affection, ordinary smallness, started feeling like insufficient electricity after high-level war. I was not going to make that mistake. So when the Min case closed and the country spent 3 weeks pretending it had just discovered that handsome rich men with cultural foundations often lie on tax filings, I took 2 days off and went home. My father thought I had been suspended. My mother thought I looked thin. My sister said, "You have the face you get whenever an institution starts congratulating itself too much for something you did." I hate how much she resembles a blunt instrument disguised as family. She was right. I slept, helped at my father's shop, ate real food, watched small customers argue over screws, hose fittings, and the exact price difference between two kinds of drill bit as if those were the most meaningful numbers in the world. It helped, because those numbers were real too. Not recoverable hidden tax. Just money ordinary people actually feel leaving their hands. You need that scale around you if you want to spend your life hunting richer lies without becoming a worse person. When I went back to Seoul, the task force had already moved on to a foundation case tied to a former minister and a shipping line. Good. Motion is safer than applause. Power always tests the same weakness eventually. Not greed. Flattery. If you can survive greed, the institution starts trying to tell you a better story about yourself instead. Mine arrived through Deputy Commissioner O. Not the old deputy director from my earlier years. Not the private sector O either. Another branch of the same national species. Intelligent, careful, pleasant enough to survive in photographs, and morally empty in ways that only become visible when timing turns sharp. Above his head floated 164,000,000. Embarrassingly small. That made him worse. He called me into his office after the Min case and congratulated me on balanced aggression, which is the kind of phrase bureaucrats use when they want you to feel seen without yet offering anything solid enough to count as protection. Then he asked whether I had ever considered the policy side of tax enforcement. That should have sounded boring. It didn't. Policy means reach. Reach means earlier design. Earlier design means you stop catching only the thieves who already slipped and start shaping, which thieves the system can touch before the public even knows what category will exist. It was tempting. O knew that. That is why he brought it up. He said men like me could spend 10 years in field enforcement and still only move the bill after the theft, while the people writing policy moved the shape of the law itself. All true. He also said the service needed younger officers who understood both private sector creativity and public duty without sentimental confusion about high net worth complexity. There it was. The bait under the compliment. He was not inviting me because he believed in my ethics. He was inviting me because he had decided my anger might be useful if translated early enough into cleaner institutional language before it grew teeth in his direction. I thanked him, told him I'd think about it, left. Then I stood in the stairwell for 3 full minutes staring at the red number above my memory of his face and tried to remember something my mother had once said after one of my old private sector promotions. Success always arrives carrying an opinion about what parts of you are convenient. That was the whole problem. Policy was not wrong. Reach was not wrong. But if I moved too early, under the wrong sponsor, I would stop becoming an investigator and start becoming a curated version of one, sharp enough to sound principled, smooth enough never to make the building itself uncomfortable in the wrong wing. So I took the problem to the only person in the service I trusted to answer without decorating the answer. Section Chief Nam. He listened, drank terrible tea, and said, "Take the meeting." I knew you'd say that. No, you didn't. You hoped I'd save you from thinking. Annoyingly accurate. He leaned back and continued. The question isn't whether policy is corrupting. Of course it is. The question is whether you can enter it without forgetting what field pressure smells like. Too many men go upstairs and start speaking as if delay were merely procedural. You'd be dangerous there. That sounds approving. It sounds expensive, he said. Everything useful in government is expensive to somebody. I took the second meeting. Not the job. The meeting. Deputy Commissioner O laid out the track more clearly that time. A hybrid assignment. Task force through year-end, then policy-shaping coordination with visibility on large-case category design. More reach. Less clean field work. more contact with lawmakers, ministry staff, and all the delicate places where the Korean state remembers too late that it was designed by people with relatives. I told him I would need time. He smiled. Of course, I'd worry if you accepted too quickly. No, he wouldn't. He'd respect it. That was worse. I went home angry. Not because of him. Because he was offering something I actually wanted. That is always the most dangerous temptation. Not the thing you despise. The thing that fits your ambition well enough to sound like destiny if you stop asking one more question. Unpaid asked the right question for me without even knowing the full file. We were eating late after one of her PEDS cases had turned an ordinary day into surgery, ICU, tears, and one more Korean family learning how quickly modern medicine becomes ancient fear once a child stops breathing correctly. I told her only the outline: bigger role, more reach, policy side, possible move. She listened and said, "Do you want the work or the permission?" I stopped chewing. There it was again. The same divide. Different building. Different uniform. Same trap. Because the policy job would not only let me shape more, it would also tell the institution, and maybe myself, that I was now the kind of man it trusted near the levers before everyone else had been fully processed through pain. I hated how much that mattered to me. I don't know, I said. Good, she answered. If you knew too fast, I'd be more worried. That helped. So did not deciding immediately. By then, I had learned the value of letting ambition cool just long enough for character to catch up and ask what exactly it is being recruited into. While I waited, the foundation ministershipping case detonated. And because life is rude, it detonated under my name. The foundation case should have belonged to 3 different newspapers and 6 committees before it ever got close to me. Former minister. Shipping exposure. Charitable Youth Education Foundation. Offshore service line. 2 nephews, 1 mistress, and enough patriotic ribbon on the public story to make ordinary citizens feel guilty for distrusting it. The number above the former minister's head when he entered the liaison room later was 111-270, 000, 000. That is the kind of amount that changes the emotional temperature of a file, not because bigger theft is morally more offensive, because larger sums attract larger protectors. By the time money gets that large in Korea, it is never only money anymore. It is network, history, institutional memory, mutual blackmail dressed as civility. Our task force got the case because no single regional office could carry it without too much visibility too early. Good in theory, bad in practice, because it meant everyone above us was already thinking about headlines before the evidence had finished settling into its own skeleton. Beek handled the structure well. Quiet, compartmentalized, no leaks, no moral theater. I took beneficial movement sequencing. Sierra took foundation disbursement timing. Our forensics man followed shipping-side invoicing. The case was ugly enough to feel almost classic. Public service branding, educational charity, import-export valuation games, a property line through a cousin's wife, and 1 consulting contract so absurdly overpaid it might as well have been titled, "We Hope No One Reads This." Then the media got it early anyway. Not the whole case. Enough. A columnist hinted at overreach by ambitious tax prosecutors. A commentator on cable asked whether anti-corruption rhetoric was becoming selective class warfare. 1 newspaper ran a photo of the former minister at a scholarship event with schoolchildren and the headline, "Is public service now a tax crime?" That was the moment I understood the leak had not come from outside. Someone inside wanted the room contaminated early. The deputy commissioner called a containment meeting. Beek went gray with contained rage. I walked in, saw the red number above 1 assistant director's head, and understood at once who had started singing to the wrong people. 143, 000. Again. Always the small, humiliating corruption inside the building. Not enough to live like a king. Just enough to explain why a man would sell process to be liked in the right circles. The leak did not kill the case. It changed the pace. From that point forward, Every memo had to survive not only legal review and administrative caution, but the political contamination of public doubt before the file itself could answer. That is exhausting work. It requires you to write as if every sentence will one day be read by someone actively hoping to misunderstand it for profit. This was where my private sector years helped more than anything else ever had, because I knew how elite defense works from the inside. Not only the lawyers, the emotional architecture, create noise, attack motive, invoke class resentment, call process selective, turn your charity into a human shield, make the institution look excited. If possible, make one ambitious younger official look like the whole engine of excess, so the public can tell a simpler story than the truth deserves. That last move came for me on a Monday. A columnist who had never once written meaningfully about tax policy published a piece describing me as a former private tax planner with a history of unstable professional conduct, now driving aggressive anti-elite audits under self-justifying reform language. It was elegant enough to do damage. My old firm had been waiting for that call. Of course they had. The article did not name Heesung, but everyone who mattered could read fingerprints. Someone had gone back, pulled the old story, and turned it into a weapon. Private sector ghost, disgruntled staffer, ideological convert, overcompensating bureaucrat. Sierra burst into my office with the article printed and said, "Do I need to kill someone?" That actually helped. "No," I said, "not yet, it's badly written." "That's your issue with this?" "No, it's just the funniest one." The real issue was whether the column would give cowards in the service enough cover to start separating the file from me under the excuse of protecting neutrality. Beek solved that before I had to. He walked into the task force room, threw the article on the table, and said, "If any of you plan to start behaving like outside noise changes internal evidence, leave now and save me the coffee." Nobody moved. That was leadership. Not beautiful, just correctly timed contempt. The file survived. The columnist got 3 more days of useful television. The former minister's lawyers started sounding subtly less confident because the paper was now too strong for the media strategy to finish the job. And me. I learned that every rise brings you back to your old life eventually. If it can't beat your current work directly, it will drag a previous version of you into the room and see whether you still flinch. This time I didn't. Not because it didn't hurt. Because pain is easier to work through once you stop mistaking it for disqualification. When the former minister finally sat across from me in a formal hearing room and tried to perform sorrow about how hard public life had been on his family, the number over his head was still burning. 111-270-000-000. He called the foundation a misunderstanding. The nephews overenthusiastic. The shipping line separate. The property chain old family complexity. All the ordinary poetry of old men who mistake long public service for a private tax exemption. I listened until he finished. Then I laid out the sequencing. Foundation inflow. Shipping diversion. Nephew compensation. Property movement. Offshore service loop. Domestic concealment. No passion. No speech. No righteous fury. Just order. That broke him faster than shouting ever could have. Because in the end, rich Korean men fear one thing more than moral accusation. Clarity without theatricality. The adjustment stuck. The foundation status imploded. The former minister stopped appearing at youth scholarship photo ops. The columnist moved on to complaining about selective tax populism in a different suit. And the deputy commissioner asked me to dinner. That was the answer to my policy question right there. Nothing inside the service ever gets that quiet unless somebody thinks your future may already be worth negotiating over food. The dinner was in a place rich people pretend not to know. Small private room. Perfect service. No loud daycare. No accidental witnesses. Deputy Commissioner O was already seated when I arrived, and the number above his head, 164,000,000, looked almost embarrassed under the lighting. That was comforting in a small, cruel way. He did not waste much time. "You handled the pressure well," he said. "That sounds like a performance review disguised as hospitality." "It's both." He poured tea instead of wine. "Interesting. Tea means senior Korean men want to signal seriousness without the vulnerability of alcohol, or they expect the person across from them to remember everything too clearly." He spoke for 20 minutes about scale, about how casework changes individual outcomes and policy changes, which outcomes become possible, about institutional timing, about younger officers who burn themselves out hunting visible corruption, while older, smarter men design the categories the visible corruption later hides in, about the need for one generation inside the service that understands both elite evasion methods and public legitimacy without becoming either naive or theatrical. It was a very good pitch. That was the problem. When he finished, I asked the only question that mattered. "If I move into policy under you, what exactly are you trying to protect?" He smiled. Tiny. Professional. Annoyingly impressed. "Better question than who are you trying to help?" Same answer sometimes. "No," he said, "that's the difference between youth and government." There it was again. The same polished surrender institutions eventually try to sell every ambitious young person who survives long enough near the levers. The world is complicated. Intention is messy. Better to choose what can be protected and leave moral appetite to columnists and students. In another life, in another industry, I might have mistaken that for wisdom. Instead, I thought about Heesung, my father's shop, the church elder, the actor, Jinwon, no, not here, Sira, Nam, Beek, every junior doctor and analyst and shop owner and underpaid staffer I had met under both systems who spent their whole lives being told complexity existed only to excuse someone richer. Then I answered him honestly. I don't want the policy line if it only means helping the service become more elegant about which rich men get touched and which ones get context. He did not look offended. He looked like a man who had just confirmed a theory. "Good," he said, "because if you came too cheaply, you wouldn't survive policy anyway." That was not comforting. He offered the hybrid role again. Broader category design. Selective case coordination. Still enough field work to avoid total bureaucratic death. Enough distance from daily audits to start shaping what kinds of cases would later even exist as targetable objects. I told him I would decide after year-end. This time the answer felt clearer already. Not no. Not yet yes. A sharper maybe than before. That was the right kind of uncertainty. When I left the restaurant, Seoul looked exactly the way rich cities always look after a good dinner has tried to convince men they're adults now. Wet light. Dark glass. Drivers waiting. Bad weather turned into luxury texture. Above a man stepping out of a black sedan, 3 doors down floated 1-2-900-000-000. He laughed into his phone. The number glowed. And I stood under the awning thinking the same thought I had been trying to refine since the first day at the NTS. The point was never just to catch thieves. The point was to keep the building from quietly training me into the same kind of man who only chases the ones his own career can survive touching. That is much harder. Casework gives you enemies. Policy tempts you into becoming your own. I went home and wrote one line in the black notebook I had started keeping after the Park case. Do not enter any room that requires you to admire your own influence more than the outcome it should serve. Then I slept for 6 hours, woke up angry in the useful direction, and went back to work. By then, the younger officers had started coming to me sooner. Not for protection. For calibration. How do you read this chain? Is this delay political or just stupid? When does caution stop being professionalism and start becoming collaboration with fear. How do you know if a senior is teaching you discipline or just exporting his own cowardice down the ladder? I answered them all as honestly as I could. Because the tax service, like every institution, did not really need one more sharp investigator. It needed fewer young people trained to confuse delay with maturity. That more than the glowing numbers was the real fight. And for the first time in my life, I was finally on the side of the glass where I could actually fight it. I took the hybrid role. Not because I trusted Deputy Commissioner O. Because I didn't. That sounds backwards until you've spent long enough inside institutions to understand a very simple rule. The rooms you can least afford to abandon are usually the ones most likely to make you unpleasant in ways your friends won't find charming over dinner. Policy was one of those rooms. It was where categories were born, not the cases themselves, the words around them, the weighting, the priority ladders. The socially acceptable reasons one kind of theft becomes a national emergency, while another gets translated into complex family circumstances, until the right old man dies. If I left that to cleaner people, the state would keep doing what it had always done. Bite hard downward, cautiously sideways, and only upward when the cameras were already aligned or the target had somehow become lonely enough not to matter. The Strategic Compliance Planning Unit was smaller than I expected and far more dangerous than it looked. No raids, no furious hearings, no dramatic folders dropped on polished tables, just quiet people, mild voices, and files that determine what the National Tax Service would be able to name aggressively 6 months later. Assistant Director Jaehyeon, who handled the unit day to day, had a face like a well-maintained grievance. She believed in order, scalability, and never letting moral excitement contaminate operational realism. In practice, that meant she was smart enough to see the truth and cautious enough to sand it down before it ever threatened the wrong tier of society. I disliked her almost immediately. She disliked me faster. Our first real collision came over a pilot prioritization grid. The service wanted to refine what kinds of cases would move into higher resource review before they became public scandals. On paper, that was obvious and necessary. In reality, the first draft looked exactly like every nervous institution's fantasy of bravery. Manageable celebrities, obvious cash businesses, inheritance sloppiness, vulgar fraud. In other words, targets rich enough to be seen and weak enough to be hit, without too many phone calls crossing ministries afterward. I rewrote the grid. Not from scratch. That would have been childish. From inside. I kept recovery value, deterrence value, case survivability, administrative burden. Then I inserted concealment architecture as a primary factor instead of an afterthought, foundation-linked property movement, family office layering, educational and cultural shelters, charitable donor vehicles, cross-generational gift compression, all the beautifully Korean ways people with great tailoring and dead parents try to move tax into a moral fog. Jaehyeon read the draft, tapped the column-headed social shielding multiplier, and said, "This would overselect politically delicate targets." "No," I said. "It would select targets the institution has trained itself to call delicate because they're wrapped in prestige." She looked at me as if I had farted in a constitutional chamber. "Policy is not therapy." "Good," I said. "Then let's stop trying to protect the institution's feelings." That did not improve the atmosphere. But the column survived. Trimmed, softened, renamed 3 times into something more breathable for bureaucrats. Still there. That mattered because the first major file to rise through the new model should never have been visible this early otherwise. Widow, family office, educational and cultural endowments, second-generation transfer pressure. One nephew with the moral posture of wet cardboard. Above the widow's face in a gala photo clipped into the briefing packet floated WAN 16, 840, 000, 000. Not ordinary theft. Not even ordinary elite theft. That was system-class money. The kind of concealed tax figure that tells you the family has not merely grown rich, but has become socially confident that wealth itself is now a civic service, and therefore should not be taxed with the same rough hand used on ordinary merchants and salaried men. The late Chairman Seo Doyoung had been mourned beautifully. Legacy pieces, Scholarship headlines, tasteful widow photos, foundation messages about continuing his commitment to youth and culture. The whole nation loves grieving rich men as long as the grief is arranged with enough expensive restraint. Underneath it, however, the family office was moving. Property, donor-linked assets, art holdings, consulting payments through the nephew's education technology company. One foundation line that behaved less like public good and more like a private inheritance corridor, wearing a nicer haircut. I knew better than to run into the room shouting family office. The state hates being embarrassed by its own timing, so I built the file in the only form institutions ever really trust. Structure first. Emotion never. Category before target. Public benefit link transfer concealment. Cultural asset valuation manipulation. Education adjacent property shielding. Foundation to family service routing. Then the family. Hyen still called it timing sensitive. Deputy Commissioner O asked whether I was letting one socially visible target distort a developing category. I set the public filings, the related party patterns, the property movement, and the foundation disbursement loops on the table and said, no, I'm letting one socially visible target prove the category is already overdue. That changed nothing and everything. Nobody in that room suddenly became brave. But once the category and the family name existed in the same packet with enough supporting logic attached, any decision not to pursue the matter would itself become a piece of paper someone senior might later need to explain. That is often the best you can do in government work. Not force virtue. Price avoidance. I sent the related public chains to Beak on the field side as well. He called me from downstairs 20 minutes later and said, you really can't resist choosing targets who invite cabinet members to funerals. Funerals are excellent places for corruption. Everyone's already dressed for hypocrisy. He hung up on me, which in Beak language was practically affection. The break did not come through the widow. Of course not. It came through the nephew. There's always a nephew. A son is often too protected, a widow too polished, a foundation chair too careful. But somewhere in every rich Korean network there is a mediocre male relative with just enough entitlement to believe paperwork should adapt around his personality. The nephew ran an educational innovation company whose revenue curves looked suspiciously like tax whether tied to family mourning. Publicly bland, privately absurd. Sierra joined me on the case because I trusted her, and because she was excellent at one thing the state rarely teaches properly: how families use affection, hierarchy, and plausible ignorance as tax instruments. She read the nephew's service contracts, looked at the percentages, and said, either this idiot discovered genius after his uncle died, or the family is laundering succession through educational language. That's romantic. That's accounting. She was right. The nephew had been paid advisory fees by two family-linked entities, reimbursed for strategic curriculum consulting through a foundation with no actual curriculum line, and somehow acquired temporary control over a cultural property storage contract. That last part looked irrelevant until we reached the violin. Yes, a violin. An instrument had moved through a family-linked educational entity under one valuation, sat in private climate-controlled storage under another, and then reappeared in insurance documentation at a far higher figure once the tax-sensitive movement was safely passed. That is the kind of case detail that sounds ridiculous until you work long enough around rich Koreans to understand that fine taste is one of the country's most underregulated tax shelters. Once the violin moved, the rest of the room moved too. Property linked to foundation purpose. Educational grants behaving like family liquidity. Nephew service firms collecting revenue no market would ever produce for them honestly. Related parties invoking grief, continuity, and public benefit, in exactly the order that tells you the lawyers have already been paid very well. The leak came after that. Not from outside. Never just from outside. Someone in the service nudged the category line before the file was ready. A columnist suddenly discovered an interest in the danger of criminalizing family philanthropy, while a culture paper ran soft profiles on the widow's educational mission. We had not named the family publicly. That meant the leak was not a smoking gun. It was worse. Atmosphere. I checked the path. Not magically, just the old way. Who had touched what when, and with what level of boredom. Then I looked up from the chain at a neighboring policy liaison while he stood by the copier, and 158,000,000 floated above his forehead like a bad joke written by a disappointed god. 58,000,001. That was what he'd sold process for. Not enough to become rich, barely enough to become disgusting. Petty corruption inside tax enforcement is always more revolting than the grand kind. Large thieves at least have the decency to worship scale. Small ones sell integrity as if it were office stationery. I told Beak where the weakness in the root sat. Not why. He did not ask why. One reason I trusted him. He solved it correctly. No grand confrontation. No internal ethics theater. He simply rerouted the next review chain, cut the liaison off from sensitive draft movement, and let the man discover over the next 10 days that every meaningful packet had somehow stopped needing his eyes. Institutions are at their best when they make petty traitors small instead of dramatic. The widow came in 2 weeks later. Perfect black suit. Measured grief. Voice low enough to suggest either discipline or generations of money. The number above her head stayed steady. 16,840,000,000. She did not panic when we laid the structure out. That was what made her dangerous. She simply inhabited the oldest defense elite Korean families have ever had. If the room remains tasteful enough, perhaps the state will lose the appetite to make ugliness factual. She called it continuity, stewardship, preserving intent, honoring legacy through institutionally aligned transition. All the language rich people use when they want tax law to understand that their family feelings are more advanced than everyone else's. I let her finish. Then I asked why a violin intended for educational stewardship had spent 9 months in private family custody, while the related foundation claimed public benefit tax treatment, and the same educational entity was paying the nephew's advisory firm strategic fees with no visible strategy attached. That was the first time her expression moved in any direction a human being might recognize. She said, "You make family continuity sound criminal." I answered, "No. I make concealed tax sound expensive enough to stop calling itself family continuity." The hearing ended without fireworks. Good. Fireworks make weak files feel strong. The file stayed alive because the institution had already been forced to admit on paper that the concealment method mattered beyond one family. That was the real win. Even if the CO case itself later got slowed, trimmed, or buried under enough expensive weather, the category now existed in the service in a form harder to deny next year. That, I was learning, was the actual policy battle. Not glorious victories. Habit chain. Round that same time, the younger officers started using a phrase I hated. They called certain matters Jaehyeon cases. Not formally, in corridors, at smoking corners, over microwaved lunch boxes and broken printer conversations. A Jaehyeon case meant a target who looked too decorated, too socially wrapped, too protected by family, culture, politics, or philanthropy to move without either better paper or worse courage than usual. I hated the phrase because it turned method into folklore. Institutions love folklore. It lets them avoid learning. If success belongs to a special type of strange man, then ordinary people inside the system are excused from becoming more competent. They can simply admire, resent, or avoid him. So I attacked the folklore the only way I know how. Training, case walks, method notes, concealment habitat grids. Workshops where Sira stood in front of rooms full of younger officers and calmly explained how family affection, public honor, charitable reputation, and bureaucratic caution interact to become tax architecture in Korea. She was excellent at it. Better than me in some ways because she had less ego in the room and more appetite for watching other people's reasoning improve. One deputy director described her workshop as surprisingly practical. She said that's because corruption is practical first. I almost swallowed my tea wrong. That was probably my fault. Good. Junseo, one of the newer officers, benefited most from those sessions. He had the face of a man who had excelled too early and therefore still believed institutions rewarded clarity if phrased professionally enough. Watching him discover where that belief stopped being true was like watching a very intelligent dog learn what glass is. Necessary, slightly painful, good for future survival. He brought me a file on a dentist couple one night because something felt wrong in the gift line, and he could not tell whether he was overreading. The husband had 196,000,000 above his head. The wife, nothing. I asked him, "Why do you think her number is 0?" He stared at the pages, then at me, then back at the pages. And there it was, not the answer, the angle. He finally looked where institutions teach you last, asymmetry inside a family story. We rebuilt the chain. The husband had hidden personal income and used the wife and daughter as narrative padding, family language, fatherly concern, educational support, all the respectable textures that turn a man's illegal concealment into a domestic blur if no one asks who actually benefited and who merely got arranged into the sentence. Junseo came back after the adjustment stuck and said, the tax wasn't family-shaped. It was one man hiding inside family-shaped paper. Yes, I said. That's why rich people love family so much on filing season. He laughed, but his face changed. More skeptical, more useful, less likely to spend the next decade mistaking warmth in documents for innocence. That mattered more to me than the adjustment itself. That was also when my father started asking worse questions. Not about job security. About character. He asked the first one while pricing hose fittings for a contractor who had been lying about quantities for so many years even my father's patience had started looking taxable. You know what worries me, he said without looking up. Only one thing. That you sound calmer now when you talk about rich people. I stopped writing. He still didn't look at me. That's how Korean fathers survive sincerity. Sideways, through hardware, through boiling water, through television volume, through pretending the thing between you is too practical for emotion when it very clearly is. I used to hear anger, he went on. Now I hear expertise. That sounds like improvement. It sounds like the point where some men stop hating rot and start admiring how well they can map it. That sat in the shop between us longer than the sentence deserved. Which is how I knew it deserved all the time in the world. Because he was right. Not fully. Enough. The more cases I touched, the easier the habitats became to read. Charity, family, grief, education, culture, prestige. Once you see enough patterns, corruption stops feeling outrageous and starts feeling architectural. That makes you efficient. It also risks making you cold in the wrong places. If everything becomes a structure, then every person inside it slowly turns into a node instead of a life. That is how state predators are made, not from sadism, from abstraction. So I wrote another line in the notebook that night. If the case only excites me because the architecture is beautiful, I'm already in danger. That line mattered 3 weeks later, when the Fiscal Integrity Forum invited me to speak. I hate public forums. They are where institutions go to describe themselves in adjectives, while waiting for younger people to make the noun sound less embarrassing. The invitation came through the commissioner's office, which meant declining would be noted and accepting would be weaponized. Fine. Typical. The topic was evolving concealment methods in public benefit and next-generation transfer structures, which is a long way of saying, explain to a room of bureaucrats, lawmakers, journalists, and board experts why Korea's rich have learned to hide tax under every word that photographs well. I spent 3 nights murdering every sentence in the draft that sounded like the service congratulating itself for discovering what we had spent years politely ignoring. No confidence architecture. No future-ready compliance posture. No public-private resilience ecosystem. I would rather eat printer toner. The version I kept started with one sentence. Tax theft in Korea no longer hides mainly in crude secrecy. It hides in socially respected language. That woke them up. Good. A room like that should never be allowed to sleep through its own subject. I laid out the habitats. Educational trusts. Cultural foundations. Family offices wearing public purpose. Succession smoothed through grief. Luxury assets translated into legacy tools. Digital concealment wrapped in youth and innovation, because this country is incapable of committing financial crime without also trying to sound generationally exciting about it. The vice minister on the panel hated it immediately. "Excellent sign," he asked, in that polished way Korean officials use when they want to seem above the dirt while still shaping it. "How do we encourage public trust without unfairly burdening socially contributing institutions?" I answered, "By taxing contribution honestly enough that only real contribution remains after the return is filed." That line made the papers. Unhelpful, satisfying, dangerous. By evening, half the younger officers in the service thought I had scored a brave policy point, and the other half thought I had just become visible enough to get myself carefully destroyed later by men who know how to smile through budget season. Both were probably right. Deputy Commissioner O left one handwritten note on my desk the next morning. "You are now visible enough to become expensive. Act accordingly." I hated how pleased that made me. So I went straight home after work, sat at my mother's table, and made myself explain the whole event without once using the phrase public trust. She listened, served soup, then said, "You sound proud." "I am. You also sound hungry in a bad way." There it was. I set the spoon down, that obvious. "I raised you. Your bad appetite arrives first in your voice, not your face. Only mothers can say something that merciless and make it sound like weather." She made me stay the night. Not because of any emotional collapse. Because, as she put it, "You look like one more round of being admired by officials away from confusing applause with oxygen." That helped. A lot. The next morning I woke up in my old room with the wallpaper still as ugly as it had always been, and remembered what scale actually feels like when nobody is flattering it. Small room, thin mattress, no vice minister, no panel lighting, just the life ordinary people are told to fit around rules written by men who rarely touch consequences directly. That fixed me enough to return to Seoul with my ambition still sharp, and my ego slightly less poisonous. Slightly. The first direct attempt to recruit me politically came through dinner. Not a formal dinner. Which made it worse. A finance committee assemblyman wanted informal insight into emerging concealment categories. Translation: he wanted to see whether I was morally theatrical, technically serious, privately vain, lonely enough to groom, or all of the above in a ratio useful to future government. Men like that never eat to learn. They eat to classify. So I did not go alone. I brought Sira. Her expression when I told her why was one of the best things I saw all month. "You want me there because I'm technically strong or because I make it harder for old men to act predatory without becoming obvious?" "Yes," I said. "That's a healthy amount of honesty, disturbing but healthy." The assemblyman recovered well when he realized I had not arrived privately enough for easy grooming. That told me he was experienced. The whole meal proceeded in the very Korean key of respectable menace. Public good language, soft laughter, questions about balancing anti-evasion rigor with social vitality, subtle attempts to discover whether my anger came from principle or class injury, and the occasional phrase so polished it made me want to test the silverware for hidden lobbyists. Sira was magnificent. He said over-auditing philanthropic entities might chill contribution. She asked whether genuine public contribution often required 3 advisory shells and a nephew. He said political climate demands discretion. She asked whether discretion and fear had been formally separated yet in the assembly, or whether the confusion remained mostly decorative. I almost choked twice. Worth it. At the end of the meal, the assemblyman touched my sleeve lightly and said, "You should be careful not to become famous for a kind of honesty institutions cannot house." I looked at his hand, then at the number above his head. 1730,000,000. Cute. "I work in tax," I said. "Housing problems are usually just valuation issues in better shoes." That got a crack in his smile. Enough. Sira waited until the elevator doors closed and then said, "That man absolutely wants to own your future voice." "That sounds poetic for you." "No," she said. "It sounds annoying. Don't let politicians adopt your vocabulary." That stayed with me. Because she was right in a deeper way than the evening itself. Institutions love articulate younger people as long as the articulation can be redirected upward into legitimacy rather than downward into force. The assembly wanted my language. The service wanted my modernity. Private firms wanted my pattern recognition. Journalists wanted my cleanly quotable contempt. Everybody wanted a usable version of me. Nobody yet wanted the whole one. Good. I prefer being difficult to package. The first massive inheritance case I touched after that made everything else look provincial. A Chaebol-adjacent manufacturing patriarch died with the usual national choreography. Memorial broadcast, scholarship montage, old labor clips, newspaper lines about grit and contribution and post-war rebuilding. A good Korean death among the rich always gets edited into public instruction before the flowers die. Meanwhile, beneath the tasteful mourning, the family started moving. A wellness foundation in the elder daughter's name. An educational trust. An advisory vehicle tied to the younger son. 2 apartments. 1 villa. A cultural property line. 1 second family nobody mentioned, and everybody of consequence clearly already knew existed. Above the patriarch's face in the memorial packet, 14,600,000,000. Above the son, 1,940,000,000. The father's number mattered for category logic. The son mattered for breakage. The son was what wealth produces when caution is outsourced to lawyers and self-restraint never becomes a survival skill. Soft face, polished watch, public modesty, private assumption that every adult in the room is either purchasable or there to confirm he deserves what he already intends to keep. He came in smiling. He left 4 hours later with that smile surgically reduced. Not because we had some grand revelation. Because he made the oldest rich man error in the country. He tried to explain his own structure. That never ends well if the investigator across from you has spent enough years around polished greed to recognize when family language is being used as thermal padding around straight concealment. The family was smoothing inheritance through health philanthropy, property shielding, and advisory continuity for the son's strategic development firm, which would have been funnier if it were not also the sort of thing that succeeds constantly in a country where old men still think their daughters' foundations and sons' boards should automatically be read as civic continuity before they are read as tax design. We broke the son. Then the apartment line. Then the second family. That last one mattered most. Not because scandal sells. Because second family wealth movement is one of the places Korea hides its most human financial dishonesty. Shame, pride, gender, status, inheritance, affection, fear. Family men who want to keep private love private until private wealth needs public law to become invisible. If you want to understand how our elite actually think about obligations, read the second family files. They are always more honest than speeches. The case did not explode publicly right away. Good. Publicity is a terrible first tool. Instead, the category note from it became internal reference language for health and education-linked inheritance concealment. Boring. Important. Exactly right. That was around the time I noticed the gift itself was changing for me. Not the numbers. My relationship to them. When I first got them, each red amount felt like an accusation and a dare. Proof that the world was filthier than it admitted and that I had been chosen, absurdly, to see the dirt first. Later, the numbers became navigation. A directional tool. Confirmation that if I kept pulling the thread, there would really be fabric and not just paranoia. Now they were becoming something else too. Ecology. Not just who stole. How theft prefers to live. What emotional climate it uses. Which Korean virtues it colonizes. When grief becomes a corridor. When family becomes padding. When charity becomes a roof. When education becomes a vault. When culture becomes insurance. When innovation becomes a password. That was bigger than any single case. And more dangerous. Because once you start seeing ecology, you start wanting control over habitat, not just prey. That is where state men become imperial in the mind. I watch for that now. Or tried to. One night after the inheritance file finally quieted, I sat alone in the office with the black notebook open and realized I had stopped writing only warnings. I had started writing design principles. Follow warmth. Most concealment in Korea eventually asks someone to feel guilty for reading closely. Every public benefit vehicle deserves one private use question before trust enters the room. If a family file is too graceful, find the least graceful male relative first. Good institutions should make pettier traitors irrelevant, not central. Never let deterrence become theater if method can become memory instead. The larger the target, the simpler your public language must stay somewhere outside the building. That last one was for my father. And for me. Because if I ever stopped being able to explain a case in hardware shop Korean, I would know the state had already translated too much of me into itself. The first real internal betrayal that hurt me did not come from a superior. It came from someone younger. His name was Kim Jaehyeon, and that is important because if you are going to spend your life inside institutions, you must resist the vanity of pretending betrayal only happens in older, uglier faces. Sometimes it arrives in the exact polished shape you were half proud to think you had sharpened well. He did not sell a major case. Not at first. He sold timing. That is more Korean anyway. Timing is where most professional corruption lives, not in open theft, in deciding who knows what when, and therefore which truth becomes survivable and which one arrives too early and dies as premature concern. The file involved a private school expansion trust with a second family line and enough educational language around it to make anyone over 50 instinctively respectful before reading page 3. We had been circling it through category design when one regional office suddenly received a highly specific legal inquiry from a firm that should not yet have known the trust line was moving beyond standard review. Not fatal, damaging, enough to tell me our internal perimeter had opened again. This time, I did not look for a tiny, corrupt number first. I looked for hunger. Jaehyeon had changed in small ways over the previous month. Better shoes, more careful hair, a little more ease in the corridor whenever deputy-level people were near. Nothing criminal in itself, just the kind of subtle social acceleration that often means a younger official has begun receiving attention from rooms too high for his current rank to visit casually. Then I looked at him during a briefing. 41 million floated above his head. 41 million won. I nearly laughed from the sheer mediocrity of it, not because the betrayal was small, because the sum was 41 million won to start poisoning your own future inside tax enforcement. The country's rich men eventually learn to steal with scale. The institution's weak men usually sell themselves at discount. I hated him immediately. Then I stopped. Because hatred is a terrible first tool against somebody you may still need to map before removing. So I watched. He wasn't leaking files cleanly. He was signaling movement, too much enthusiasm during inter-office scheduling, a harmless-sounding lunch with a legal researcher from outside, one accidental mention to a district contact that a school trust category was getting more attention than usual, enough for the right law firm to tighten their client before we were ready. Not enough for a simple corruption charge without more paper. I brought the behavioral line to Nam first. Not Beak. Not O. Nam. He read the short note, looked at me and asked, "Are you sure?" No one else in government asks that usefully anymore. Everyone else asks to protect themselves. Nam asked because he still remembered younger people were not abstraction. No, I said. I'm sure enough to treat him as dangerous and not yet sure enough to destroy him. He nodded once. Good, then we do this like adults. That meant patience. Internal route mapping. Controlled access shift. One false category meeting with a dummy emphasis line. Watching where the weather moved after. Jaehyeon failed the test in 4 days. The dummy line surfaced in outside conversation through exactly one law office dinner chain and came back to us through a district liaison whose discretion had always depended too heavily on how much he enjoyed feeling socially adjacent to expensive people. That gave us process evidence. Not beautiful. Enough. Nam took the matter upward carefully. No righteous noise. No generational speech. Just chronology, access history, controlled test, external response. Pure paper. That is how betrayal should be handled in institutions. The less you dramatize it, the harder it is for the traitor to become interesting. Junseo got transferred out under capability realignment. No scandal. No public disgrace. No moral spectacle. He passed me in the corridor once on the way to clear his desk and said, without anger, "You don't understand how this place actually works if you think all I did was betrayal." That sentence has lived in my head since. Because he was right in the worst possible way. He hadn't merely sold timing. He had also been shaped by the same hunger the whole institution rewards selectively: visibility, security, early sponsorship, proximity to people who promise they can protect your future from the randomness of ordinary excellence. In other words, he had done something ugly with entirely recognizable materials. That did not make him forgivable. It made him systemic. I wrote that down too. Do not hate betrayals so much that you miss the incentives that produced them. After Junseo left, Sira sat on the edge of my desk and said, "Are we becoming the kind of office people fear?" "That depends," I said. "Do you mean because we notice things or because the institution prefers fear to honesty?" "Both." "Fair." I thought about it longer than I wanted to. Then I answered honestly. If they fear us for reading carefully, good. If they fear us because we've become another room where ambition gets broken into useful silence, then no. She nodded once and said, "Good. Then we should probably keep checking which one it is." That was why I trusted her. Not because she agreed with me. Because she knew every room turns if no one keeps checking the grain. The giant political foundation case arrived under a lie, so clean even I admired it for 3 minutes. National Future Scholarship Consortium. If you want to hide money in Korea, always try children, education, and the future. The country will forgive almost any smell if the brochure uses the right kind of hope. The consortium was a federation of scholarship entities supposedly built to help regional technical students enter advanced engineering programs. Public mission, televised awards, governors smiling beside oversized checks, private sector donors gaining exactly the right amount of tasteful legitimacy from proximity to struggling youth. I would almost support it myself if I had not already learned that whenever a structure in this country starts saying future loudly enough, somebody inside it is usually trying to launder the present. The trigger was small. A donor mismatch. One energy sector group's declared scholarship support did not align with the consortium's intake side. Normal enough on paper, weird enough once I looked at the donor representative's face in a promotional still. 12,400,000,000. Not all his. Maybe not even most. But enough to tell me this was not a scholarship discrepancy. This was a habitat. I assembled the public shell first. Donors, partner schools, land grants, training center construction, local political endorsements. Then the private routes, consulting to affiliated education development contractors, procurement favoritism, land conversion, real estate appreciation around school sites. One pipeline where public good construction conveniently touched donor family holding lines just before reporting season in ways no one without chronic moral collapse should ever call coincidence. The more I read, the uglier it got. 3 major donors, 2 lawmakers, 1 former vice minister, a foundation chair with the smile of a man who had never once expected the state to read past the children in the brochure, 3 linked shell contractors, 2 nephews, an in-law, and 1 perfect little subline where student support housing was being used to move value into private development under a social purpose umbrella. That line alone was enough to make me stand up from my desk and walk to the window, just to keep the room from feeling too much like a confession booth. This was no longer a rich family. No longer a celebrity. No longer a widow moving inheritance behind taste. This was an ecosystem of polished patriotic theft. Exactly the sort of thing the Korean state hates most because If you touch it honestly, you do not just find lawbreaking. You find that half the adults who have been standing beside young scholarship winners for cameras now have to spend 6 months pretending they have never heard of one another. I took the first note to Beak and O together. That was deliberate. Neither of them could be trusted alone with something this large, but each had enough power to make the other's caution expensive if the paper was already shared. Beak read it and went very still. O read it and became more civil, which is always a terrible sign. Then O said, "This cannot move as a generalized donor integrity sweep. It will trigger political immunity reflex before we even have seizure-safe lines." "No," I said. "It has to move as educational infrastructure concealment tied to specific recoverable channels, or they'll use the scholarships as body armor." Beak looked at me once, then at the file, then back. "Good, he's still useful." "Oh, ignored that. You realize this will go above us immediately." "Good. Good." "Yes," I said. "The worst thing we could do is let this look manageable only at our level." That was the truth. Cases like that die best in middle-level bravery. Too big for ordinary offices, too socially poisonous for timid executives, perfect for being held in procedural amber while everyone above waits for the next scandal to make it less inconvenient. If we wanted it alive, we had to force altitude early enough that avoiding it would itself become visible. The commissioner got the file in 48 hours. 2 days later, I was in a secure review room with 3 men from ministries that never visit one another unless the weather outside is already corrupt. Tax, education, interior coordination, and 1 prosecutor. Because in Korea, every major system failure eventually attracts at least 1 prosecutor hoping history will later describe his presence as inevitable. The room was awful. Good. The scholarship consortium was exactly the kind of case that kills elegant sentences. Every time someone tried to summarize it as donor irregularity, I dragged the line back to property movement. Every time someone tried to call it sensitive due to students, I pointed out that if they were using students as social cover, then the students had already been turned into concealment assets before we arrived. Every time a ministry representative drifted toward public trust language, I asked whether public trust improved if the state politely exempted patriotic theft from literacy. That made me enemies. Also oxygen. The commissioner eventually said, "Proceed under asset concealment and educational infrastructure misuse. Narrow the human interest exposure, widen the economic line." That was exactly right. One of the few times I have seen a senior official in Korea understand that the only way to protect the innocent parts of a dirty public story is to make the guilty parts materially unavoidable first. The case took 9 months. 9 months of meetings, subpoenas, quiet panic, a lawmaker's aide trying to feel out whether my future in the service required less ideological sharpness. One donor CEO's wife calling her charity work proof of value alignment. One university dean behaving as if academic prestige should count as tax amnesty. 3 shell contractors breaking at different rates. 2 nephews discovering too late that family reputation is only useful if the state remains bored enough to admire it. We did not get all of them. That almost never happens. We got enough. Enough for recovery. Enough for donor panic. Enough for the consortium structure to collapse under a new public explanation, harsher than mismanagement and cleaner than the full truth. Enough for the educational infrastructure misuse category to become a permanent line inside the service after that. That was the part I cared about most. Because institutions forget scandals. They remember categories. The public learned one version. The state kept another. I made peace with that only because the kept version was, for once, more useful than the pretty one they aired. By then I had become visible enough that newspapers started speculating about my future. Task Force Chief by 40. Policy Bureau. Special Anti-Evasion Line. Some idiot called me the face of modern tax enforcement, which made my skin try to leave my body. Sierra printed that article and wrote in red across the top. If you become a face, I'm resigning on principle. That helped a lot. The year I almost quit the service was not the year I was most angry. It was the year I was most tempted to stay forever. That is the uglier danger. Anger keeps the edges raw, temptation smooths you. I then the building knew my name, the policy line wanted my categories, field bureaus wanted my read, younger officers quoted my workshop lines back at me in rooms I never entered, and the commissioner's office had started letting me into planning conversations 2 grades above where a man my age usually gets oxygen. That should have pleased me. It did. That was the problem. One night after a meeting on next cycle concealment priorities, I caught myself standing alone in the elevator mirror rehearsing a future version of my own career as if it were already an institutional asset to be managed properly. No target, no taxpayer, no case, just trajectory, status, right rooms, wrong rooms, pace. I hated that because it felt good. So I took 3 days off, lied to no one about why and went home. Worked the shop. Ate with my parents. Listened to my sister complain about a school administrator who had apparently discovered the phrase community-facing transparency and was now using it to avoid answering basic budget questions. Korea really is the same country in every building. On the second night, my father said, "You know what people in the neighborhood say? That I'm a bureaucrat now and therefore probably overcooked noodles. No, they say you've become important." I braced. Then he added, "Important people always start sounding more patient when they're actually less willing to be interrupted." That was such a devastatingly accurate description of senior Korean officialdom that I almost laughed. Then I realized he wasn't only talking about officialdom. He was talking about me. So I checked. Hard. He was right. Again. I had become better at wading through people's fear, confusion, and mess in hearings. Worse at it outside official contexts where there was no file to justify my patience as work. The institution had not made me cruel. It had started making me selectively tolerant in ways too flattering to notice from the inside. That changed how I came back. Not the job. The manner. I started taking the younger officers to lunch more often with no agenda. Not mentorship lunch, actual lunch. I let Sierra tell me when I sounded like a government brochure with wrists. I made myself stay in district hearings longer when the taxpayer was ordinary and frightened, not because it changed the major structural outcomes, but because if the state cannot sound human downward while claiming courage upward, then it is simply one more wealthy machine with national branding. The interesting thing is that the work did not weaken after that. It got better. Junseo, once transferred back from his lesson and no longer trusted with sensitive timing but still too intelligent to waste entirely, became sharper in narrower lanes because I stopped treating him as either future villain or rescued project. Sierra got harder and funnier and less willing to let deputy directors use strategic language as a sedative. Even Hyun, who still looked at me like I had been generated in an inappropriate policy lab, started asking for my read on early category drafts before she sent them upward, which is the closest thing people like her get to respect. The building had not improved. Not really. I had just started insisting on a different internal scale. That is the thing I would tell any younger officer now, if I had only one useful sentence left. Institutions do not devour you all at once. They improve your posture first. I wrote that in the notebook too. Then went back upstairs and built the next category before someone cleaner used legacy transition trust. One more time without having to say why that phrase in this country now made me reach for a pen like a weapon. And yes, I stayed. Of course I stayed. Not because the service was pure. Because it was. Not because the cases were glamorous. Because they never were. Not even because the gift made me special. It only made me responsible in a direction I had not asked for. I stayed because every time I thought about leaving, I saw too clearly what would happen if rooms like mine got handed fully back to smoother men. The categories would blur. The philanthropies would recover their halo. The second sons would keep inheriting through consultants and condolences. The state would go back to being stern with convenience stores and reverent with educational grief. The younger officers would start learning delay as professionalism again. Too bad. I had become too expensive for that version now. And if I was careful, really careful, maybe I could stay expensive without turning into just another predator with public language. That was the next fight. It still is. The next fight arrived with a word I had learned to distrust on sight. Legacy. Anytime Korean wealth starts saying legacy too lovingly, I assume three things. Someone has died or is about to. Someone else is preparing to be praised for grief. And tax law is about to be asked again to admire family architecture more than arithmetic. The file came from a financial industrial group with one foot in construction, one in logistics, one in education, and both hands inside every kind of committee photograph this country uses to reassure itself the powerful are at least photographed often enough to count as responsible. The founder was ill, not dead yet, just publicly weakened enough that succession whether had started moving through the family office before the obituary people were ready. Above the founder's photo and a briefing deck floated Won 18, 220, 000, 000. Above the eldest son, Won 3060, 000. Above the younger daughter, 0. Above the family office legal trustee, Won 110, 000, 000. The daughter's 0 told me more than the father's number did. Again, asymmetry. Again, family architecture. The daughter sat on 3 public boards and 1 educational foundation. The son controlled the logistics side. The legal trustee handled continuity. And hidden inside the whole performance was one trust transition line that made it possible to move appreciation now, taxation later, and responsibility never if enough institutions agreed to call the corridor legacy stabilization, instead of rich people preserving bloodline with better accounting. This time, I did not build the first note myself. That was the point. I gave the file to Sira and Junseo together. Not as punishment, not as growth theater, because if I kept being the one who saw the shape first and wrote the paper first and dragged the room first, then all I was really building was a brighter personality cult inside government. That may satisfy ambition. It does not survive retirement. Sira hated the trust line immediately. Junseo initially focused on the son. Good. Then Sira dragged him into the family asymmetry, and he changed angle fast enough that I finally let myself believe he might survive his own hunger after all. Their first memo was excellent. Not because it sounded like me. Because it didn't. Sharper on family power. More patient on public institutional masking. Less pleased with itself when it got a sentence right. I rewrote only 2 paragraphs. Both for survivability, not meaning. Then I sent it up under their names first and mine as sponsor. That was the first time in years I felt the exact kind of pride I trust. Not in my own voice. In someone else's getting stronger near it without becoming an imitation. The case moved painfully. Good. Large family office work should. The founder's side tried the old Korean sequence. Health, dignity, continuity, employee stability, national contribution. Too important to disrupt inheritance. All the stale emotional blackmail rich families use when they need the state to confuse private wealth weather with public safety. This time, though, our office was ready earlier. The category language from the school trust case held. The educational shielding logic from the widow file held. The inheritance health crossover note from the Chaebol family line held. One by one, old hiding places became less like traditions and more like repeated methods. That is when I understood the file itself mattered less than what it proved. The ecosystem was learning. Not the rich. They never really learn. The state. Slowly. Badly. Still usefully. When the eldest son finally came in for formal clarification, he tried the exact performance his father's generation had always used. Calm hurt, restrained nobility, References to workers, continuity, and the responsibility of preserving a founder's values. He would probably have beaten half the country with it. Unfortunately for him, the younger country was in the room this time too. Sira walked him through the trust timing. Junseo locked the logistics valuation. I took the legal trustee's continuity memo apart until it finally admitted what it had always been. Not preservation of business stability, but preemptive mitigation of taxable transfer under illness cover. The son's face changed slowly. That was the satisfying part. Not the panic. The dawning realization that the room had become too literate for his family's preferred dialect. Afterward in the corridor, Junseo said, "I think that's the first time I've ever watched a rich heir realize our reading level was the problem." "That's because you used to still want their approval a little," Sira said. He frowned, did. "Congratulations," I said. "You're now employable in your own conscience." That got me a laugh from both of them. Useful. Laughter is a better corruption shield than most public service branding. The case itself will matter later. The category already mattered now. 3 ministries. 2 bureaus. 1 new internal guidance line. 1 less comfortable way for old money to call succession, whether a civic necessity. That was enough for the season. More than enough, honestly. The cost came through me. Not a scandal. Not a breakdown. Fatigue with direction. I woke up one Thursday and realized I had spent so long inside habitats of theft that every nice sentence in public had started sounding like prelude. Charity gala, concealment weather, school trust, family smoothing, cultural preservation, valuation tunnel, social impact, donor shell potential. Once that happens, you risk losing not only innocence, which is fine, but proportion. I did not want to become incapable of believing in any public good that wasn't first dragged through an audit. So I left Seoul for 2 days. No conference. No task force. No family visit. Just a provincial town where nobody knew my face, a motel too clean to trust but cheap enough to calm me, and 1 notebook. I sat by a reservoir in ugly winter light and wrote the only thing that mattered. Suspicion is not the same as clarity. Do not let the gift turn all social warmth into camouflage by default. That was harder than any category model. Harder than any hearing. Because it meant admitting the work had entered my nervous system deeply enough to start editing what I could believe about ordinary life. I came back better. Not healed. Calibrated. That's usually enough. On my first morning back, Deputy Commissioner O called me in and asked whether I had considered senior track candidacy 3 years early. There it was. The next bite. He made the case well. Of course he did. Earlier authority, more structural reach, category ownership, national coordination influence, room where future priorities would become budget, not merely better arguments. He even had the decency not to call it service. He called it shape. People like you, he said, either eventually take responsibility for the whole machine or spend the rest of their lives pretending their critique was more morally serious than their fear. That was a good sentence. Worse, it was one I might have admired from myself in another mood. So I answered carefully. I'm not afraid of the machine. No. I'm afraid of becoming fluent enough in it that I start mistaking its appetite for necessity. That quieted the room. O looked at me for a long time, then nodded once and said, "Good, you're still expensive in the right way." I have no idea whether that was praise or diagnosis. Possibly both. I told him I would think about the track. Then I went back to my desk and stared at the next file waiting there. Not glamorous. Not nationally significant. A regional freight owner. 1 ChurchLink property line. 1 daughter's apartment. 1,287,000,000 above his head. Good. That was the right file to see next. Because if the next stage of my life was going to be more authority, more room, more policy, more influence, then I needed the reminder in front of me before anything else. The work is still the bill. not the altitude. I opened the file and started reading. That is how I knew the first massive part of this second life in the tax service had finally settled into its real shape. Not man with supernatural gift hunts bad rich people. Too childish. It was this. A man who can see hidden tax enters an institution built to notice the wrong things too late and spends years trying to make that institution read richer Koreans more honestly, without letting the institution itself teach him the same beautiful cowardice in cleaner language. That is a much harder story. Good, hard stories survive better once the slogans die. The regional freight owner turned out to be exactly what I needed. Not because the case was morally pure. Nothing in tax work is. Because it was small enough to clean the palate. A church-linked property line, one daughter's apartment, a freight business that had been quietly treating depreciation like prayer, and a man with $287 million above his head who still looked personally offended that the state might read his books more carefully than his pastor had. No ministers, no foundations with national branding, no donor galas, no cultural trustees with violin storage. Just ordinary Korean petty concealment with enough family language around it to sound respectable until the ledgers started contradicting the testimony. I took the file myself. Not because it needed my level. Because I needed the scale. He broke exactly the way men like him always do. First came the tone. I have paid all my life. Then the misunderstanding. My wife handles some of this. Then the wounded morality. Are we criminals now because my daughter needed stability? By the time I laid the property sequence against the church-linked valuation support and the freight company depreciation sheltering, we were back in the real world. One middle-class family trying to use piety and paperwork to make a tax burden smaller than their self-image could tolerate. That file settled me. Not emotionally. Professionally. It reminded me of something the bigger cases always threaten to blur. A tax officer who can no longer feel the smaller thefts correctly has already started ranking citizenship by prestige. That is how the state becomes a mirror of the rich instead of their correction. So when Deputy Commissioner O asked me again, a week later, whether I had reached a view on senior track candidacy, I had a cleaner answer ready. Yes, I said. He sat back in his chair just enough to let me know he had expected that word and still wanted to see what followed it. Yes, I repeated, if I retain field rotation authority and training oversight. He was quiet for a second. Those are unusually specific conditions for your grade. They're the only ones that matter. To you. Yes. That amused him. Explain. So I did. If you move me upward and take away field contact, then sooner or later you are not promoting a tax officer. You are promoting a man who speaks elegantly about deterrence while other people carry the texture of consequence for him. If you move me upward and take away younger officer training, then the service gets one useful senior and loses the only part of my work that might still matter after I leave a room. In other words, I was willing to rise. I was not willing to be translated. That kept the room still longer than most of our conversations did. Then O said, you negotiate like someone who still imagines the institution needs you more than you need it. No, I said. I negotiate like someone who understands what version of me would be easiest for the institution to own. That was the nearest thing to full honesty either of us had ever put on the table. He approved both conditions. Not out of generosity. Because the commissioner's office had already decided that a younger officer who could both shape categories and still smell paper in field conditions was worth preserving for a while before the inevitable smoothing started in earnest. That was my real promotion. Not title. Terms. The official track changed 3 months later. Nothing dramatic. A revised line in the internal registry, a different desk, a slightly larger office I distrusted on site, and enough new access that people in neighboring divisions started deciding, correctly, that being rude to me might now cost them more paperwork later than it used to. The first thing I did with the new role was build a training lane the building didn't know it needed yet. Not technical tax training. That already existed. Korea is full of excellent technical training designed by men who think human behavior enters concealment mostly by accident. What we lacked was habitat training. How to read prestige as a concealment layer. How to separate grief from succession weather. How to tell when a foundation is doing public work and when it is only being used as moral noise around private movement. How to hear the words community, education, continuity, and support without becoming sentimental before the third page. How to write a file so that the target's social beauty doesn't become the reviewing office's emotional burden. Sierra helped design it. Of course she did. By then, our professional rhythm had become one of the most reliable facts in my life. She handled the younger officers more cleanly than I did because she did not accidentally radiate future state function, the way I sometimes had begun to. She still looked like a woman who might laugh at the building if it got too proud of itself. That mattered. Institutions get healthier around people who remain visibly capable of contempt. Junseo, to my surprise and relief, became useful in the training lane too. Not as a hero story. That would have been offensive. As a warning with a desk. He never spoke publicly about the internal leak incident. Neither did I. The service had handled him the right way, smaller, sideways, alive. But over time he grew into one of the better people in the room for teaching younger officers how institutional hunger disguises itself. He could explain the first stage of corruption in a language no ethics manual ever gets right because he had almost married it personally. Not greed, sponsorship hunger, early access, social acceleration. The feeling that one dinner, one call, one useful favor might save you from the randomness of ordinary merit. That made him one of the few people I trusted to talk honestly about danger without enjoying the authority too much. The training lane did more than I expected. Younger district officers started sending category questions upward before the cases got warped by local fear. Foundation files began arriving with better first notes. One inheritance unit in Busan completely rebuilt its internal triage on emotional shielding vehicles, which is still one of the best bureaucratic phrases I ever accidentally helped create. Two new deputy managers from regional offices later told me they had stopped making sensitivity their first adjective on rich family files because the training had finally made them understand sensitivity is often just the social tax placed on investigators before the real tax ever gets assessed. That mattered. More than press. More than the vice minister's panel. More than one politician hating me for a season. Round then, the service got handed a file that proved Korea had started finding new ways to industrialize old lies. A public-private innovation cluster. I hate those words together on instinct now. The government had partnered with 3 private groups, 2 universities, and 1 regional development authority to create a so-called future mobility research district. Drones, battery labs, student innovation housing, overseas talent attraction. Everything modern Korea loves because it lets old money wear the face of tomorrow while still building profit corridors through land, subsidies, and tax treatment that would embarrass a medieval duke. The trigger came through import tax irregularities on battery equipment. The real case lived underneath. Subsidized land. Research credits. Partner foundations. Housing allowances. Cross-border consulting. 1 vice governor's brother. 2 donor-link shell vendors. 1 university housing entity behaving like a private real estate incubator with youthful branding. And above the smiling cluster chairman in the promotional brochure, 121 430 000 000. That was the largest number I had seen, yet tied to a semi-state structure. It changed the room immediately. Not because the money was new. Because the state itself was entangled in the costume. These are the hardest Korean cases, not simple public corruption, not simple private evasion, hybrid structures where the government has already stood on stage and called the thing national progress before anyone asks whether half the value is being skimmed through procurement, subsidized land, and innovation-scented shells. Once that happens, every audit becomes not only a legal event, but an insult to someone's policy legacy. The country hates those. It prefers forward motion to accounting, especially when children, Universities, batteries, and words like future keep appearing in the brochure. Jaehyeon wanted to split the case into narrower, safer sublines. Understandable. Cowardly. O wanted to move with maximum institutional coordination, which is code for if we go too fast and embarrass a ministry, everybody will suddenly discover procedure like a religion. Beek wanted the procurement shells and did not care what adjective the government had stapled onto them. I wanted the whole ecology. For once, I didn't get what I wanted fully. Good. That would have been suspicious. We moved in layers. Procurement shell first, then subsidy misuse, then research housing tax treatment, then partner foundation consulting movement, then donor vendor loops. The vice governor's brother had to wait longer than I liked because public bodies are still very good at pretending cousins, or whether until the third memo and a phone call from a different ministry happen in the right order. It was maddening. It was also the correct strategic route. That is the thing younger people misunderstand most about state work. Refusing compromise is not the same as refusing sequence. If I had insisted on the whole case all at once, the cluster would have wrapped itself in national innovation, university pride, youth employment, and regional development, and the newspapers would have spent 6 weeks asking whether tax officers had become anti-future. Instead, we took the procurement shells. They cracked. Then the research housing. That cracked too. Then the subsidy side. By the time the public still believed the case was about administrative irregularity, the actual tax architecture was already weak enough that future mobility language could no longer protect the private extractions hiding underneath. The chairman looked stunned in his hearing, which always gives me less pleasure than it probably should. Men like him are never stunned by law. They're stunned that the state remained boring long enough to survive seduction. The vice governor's brother behaved exactly the way all vice governors' brothers behave when the public-private future district stops feeling abstract. He became sick, then misunderstood, then a victim of overzealous interpretation, then unavailable, then briefly patriotic again. The progression really is almost comforting once you've seen it enough. That case made me visible in a much worse way than media ever had. Ministry people started classifying me. Not publicly. Around tables. One of those younger officers from the tax service who understands private layered concealment. Strong on foundations. Aggressive on donor-linked structures. Useful in hybrid jurisdiction problems. Potentially difficult around politically symbolic entities. That last category is the only one I care about. Potentially difficult. Good. That means the machine has started noticing which parts of itself I still have not agreed to help lubricate. The price of that arrived through my sister. She worked in education administration, not politics, but the country is small enough that once your name starts passing around certain tables, relatives get touched by air pressure before any direct storm arrives. Her school administrator told her over coffee that your brother sounds brilliant but very intense in the current climate, which is one of those Korean sentences that means no one is threatening you today, but you should understand the weather forecast has turned social. When she told me, she did not sound afraid. She sounded irritated. Am I supposed to be impressed they found a cowardly adjective for you? No. Good, because it's weak. Then, because she is my sister and therefore biologically incapable of letting me win a conversation cleanly, she added, but don't enjoy this too much. People who think they're becoming a problem sometimes start causing one out of vanity. That landed. Again. Always the same lesson from different mouths. Do not mistake friction for mission if the friction starts flattering you. So I went back to the notebook. If the institution starts calling me difficult, ask whether the outcome got cleaner or only my self-image did. That was one of the harder entries to write. Because the answer is never pure. Because sometimes the outcome does get cleaner and the self-image still gets drunk. Because adulthood, if it means anything, is learning to inspect even the part of your virtue that gives you energy. I still wanted the senior track. I should say that plainly. Not because it sounded important. Because with the innovation cluster case and the trust line categories and the training lane all alive at once, I could finally see the outline of a role broad enough to matter after me. That was new. The early years were all appetite and correction. Catch him. Break that shell. Build this file. Stop that leak. Survive the next room. Now I had started wanting continuity. Not continuity of my name. Of method. Of culture. Of younger officers who would one day not need a man like me to tell them that social sensitivity is often just the first fee powerful people charge the state for reading carefully. That is a less cinematic ambition. Much better for the country. Potentially worse for the soul if you let it turn into paternalism. So I watched that too. The final event of that stretch was small enough it would bore any newspaper and big enough that it told me exactly where I now stood. The district office in Giala sent up an inheritance file with a perfectly ordinary cover note and one extremely unordinary paragraph at the end. The officer handling it was 27, first major rich family line. The target was not famous. The money was not national. The family had a private educational trust, a public grief story, and one art storage asset that might have been entirely legitimate or might have been the first signal of a familiar habitat. In the note she wrote, I think this may be one of the cases your unit has been teaching us how to see, but I would like confirmation before the room tells me I am being dramatic. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Not because it was poetic, because it meant the work had already left my floor. That is the only kind of success I trust anymore. I called her myself. Walked her through the asymmetry. The trust line. The emotional shield. The need to build paper, not mood. The importance of asking one private use question before the institution starts admiring the family's public language. She listened. Asked the right follow-up. Corrected her note. Moved the file. When I hung up, I sat there in the larger office I still didn't like, and finally admitted what the second life inside the tax service had become. Not a revenge run. Not a superhero story. Not even mainly a hunting story anymore. It was a governance story. A man who can see hidden tax enters a state trained to blink upward, learns how Korean wealth disguises itself through virtue, grief, education, culture, family, innovation, and public good, and then spends years trying to teach the state to keep reading once the costumes get expensive. That is the real shape now. Harder, slower, less glamorous, better. And for once, when I looked at the next file waiting on my desk, I did not feel only appetite. I felt responsibility that had finally grown out of hunger without becoming tame. That was enough to keep going. So I did.